Okay, so I am here with Sasha Struthers, who is a lawyer who is going to help us understand two propositions that will be on the ballot in about a month. Sasha, tell us about Proposition 33 to start with.
Proposition 33 is a ballot measure that got on the ballot by Michael Weinstein, who's the head of the AIDS Healthcare Foundation. It's his third attempt at getting rent control in California. This time, it's probably the craziest measure that he has. What it allows is local jurisdictions, if this passes, would be able to impose what's called vacancy control. It would undo Costa Hawkins. Costa Hawkins was a measure in 1995 that said single-family condos and new construction was exempt from rent control, and that there was vacancy decontrol. So if you had a rent-controlled property, once the property became vacant, you, the landlord, could ask market rent. This proposition would allow local jurisdictions to do away with those. So houses, condos, and new construction could all be subject to rent control. And the local jurisdictions could also have vacancy control. So once a tenant moves out, the rent that they have is pretty much the rent the new tenant is going to be paying, maybe a nominal increase. So if you have a very low paying, low rent unit, and you get the unit back, the tenant moves out, maybe they pass away, the rent would be the same. You wouldn't be able to get market rent anymore.
So are you saying that if somebody passes away in a unit, for example, and the landlord goes in and updates it, they can't put the rent up?
It's possible. It depends on how the local jurisdictions would do such an ordinance. But essentially, it gives carte blanche to all these local jurisdictions to impose rent control as they see fit. So there's no safeguards for landlords. There's no exemptions for certain kinds of landlords or types of properties. So it would, depending on where you're at and how renter-friendly that jurisdiction is, it would just give them more power to control what a landlord could do with their property or how much money they could make with the property.
And when you think about it, renting is seasonal. So let's say you rented a house for $20,000 in the winter, but you could get $35,000 in the summer. Does that mean you can't change the rent?
Possibly. It really, when you have real estate as it is now, with a lot of jurisdictions, they have imposed more and more rent control, that they've had to be very careful in how they've done it because of Costa Hawkins. You can't overstep that. So a lot of single family and condos and new construction, they've been limited on how they could control it. With this, we already have, in instance, Los Angeles, there's different jurisdictions that have sort of controls on short-term rentals, which is a little bit what you're talking about. So I rent my house by the beach in the summer and the winter at different rates. Different jurisdictions have sort of cracked down on that and prohibited short-term rentals, or, had imposed restrictions like you had to pay a permit, you had to register, maybe there was a lottery. At some point, I forget which jurisdiction, but they had it like you could short-term rental your house, but you had to stay in the house with the guest. Like there was all these weird rules. So if this passes, the local jurisdictions could pretty much do anything that they wanted. They would have carte blanche. Like, I don't want you to short-term rental. I don't want you to be able to get market rent. They already have in some jurisdictions eviction restrictions. So they have just cause restrictions in LA City. So even though you have a house that's for rent, once you get a tenant in there, it's hard to get them out unless you have a reason to do so. Maybe they haven't paid their rent. Maybe they're delinquent. Maybe, you want to own or occupy your house again. You can't just give a tenant 60-day notice anymore. And the buyer, a lot of buyers, when they buy a house, they want to move in, or the bank requires them to move in. And so it's been really hard for sellers to sell properties that have tenants in them. They've had to buy them out. So as far as like seasonal things, like, doing it in the winter versus the summer, again, depending on how the jurisdiction does it, that might not even be an option for a property owner.
No, I'm not even saying, is this going to be a seasonal thing? It's just like this particular house we're sitting in now. If I rent this in the winter months, if the year starts in the winter months, it will probably get a lower rent than if it starts in, say, March or April or something like that. But okay, so the Just Cause law just went into effect like a year ago. Can you explain that too?
So there's a few different jurisdictions that have them. Santa Monica has them. I believe West Hollywood might have them. LA City has them. Pasadena has them. What these laws mean is that once you put a tenant in place, whether it's a house, a condo, an apartment, newer construction, older construction, regardless. You no longer can just end the tenancy. Like if the lease is up in a year, typically you'd be okay, you're going to have to move out. Maybe we'll do a renewal. If it's a month to month, you used to be able to give a 60-day notice and say, okay, in 60 days, you have to move out. So just cause prevents that. Just cause says basically once you move a tenant into a house or a residence, you can't get them out unless you have a just cause reason to do it. Now, some ways that landlords are able to maybe get houses back is if they raise their rent really high on a single family. But in that case, sometimes it triggers like an economic impact. The tenant can ask for relocation money in order to move out because the rent is too high. But that's kind of the downside of what all of these laws are. It's like they keep putting fear in landlords. So now it's like, I might be able to hash out like a reasonable rent with you. Like, hey, I could probably raise it market, but you're a good tenant, I'll work with you. But if you have a tenant who's been in there, their rent's really low, or maybe they've kind of been a nuisance tenant, those evictions are really hard to do. Now you have to like sort of get creative in how do you get the tenant out. And then it just results in landlords going, okay, well, I'm going to jack up the rent as high as I possibly can. So I think in some ways, people want to prevent that from happening. But I also think landlords being cornered into situations like that are a direct result of overregulation. It's a very bizarre way to go about things, but it's kind of where I see things going is landlords are just going to get a little bit more creative in a way that's not going to foster, a positive relationship with tenants.
Do you think it's going to pass?
I don't know. There's a lot of people in favor of it. And I think people are in favor of it for the simple fact we just came out of a pandemic. We're in an administration where inflation is at an all-time high. And so everyone feels squeezed. The tenant feels squeezed, the landlord feels squeezed. And what we're really struggling with as a society, and I'll talk about California specifically, is that tenants weren't always meant to be tenants this long. And so there's so many people, that are in their late 20s, early 30s, 40s, 50s that thought they would buy a house by now, and they're priced out of it. Then there's the high cost of interest. Interest if you were to get a mortgage. Insurance is really high. If you buy a property, your property taxes are based on the market. And so utilities are going up. So all of these factors are compounding where the landlords are having to pay these increased costs, but at the same time, tenants aren't able to advance their own lives. And that in part is, one, I guess it would be the pandemic, but it's also just historically, we haven't been building enough housing in the state. And that was really at a local level. City councils across the state get busted for it. They go, hey, you're not letting apartments be built, or you're not letting houses be built. You're not letting things evolve. And so demand has outpaced the supply. And so that's the issue with Proposition 33, is we are making, the state is working towards, okay, let's get more housing. Let's get, more developers on board. Let's give them more incentive to do this. And a lot of the local jurisdictions have kind of thwarted those efforts. But also this proposition, it would be why would I do that? If I'm a developer and you want me to build all this housing, let's say multifamily apartments, if my rent is basically going to be solidified the day the tenant moves in with little increments, there's no upside for me.
Also, Measure ULA has made it so that profit that the developers had is now going to the government, whether they make money or not for the developers.
That's also another problem, is when you start giving voters sort of the incentive to tax. A lot of people vote and they see these ballot measures and they go, oh, this sounds great. Oh, rent control, that's going to be perfect. Oh, the rich people aren't paying their fair share of taxes. And with EULA, the city council, and they've admitted it indirectly, we lied about it. We said we were only going to tax these mega mansions. But in fact, it affected everyone. It affected single families in all sorts of neighborhoods, and it affected multifamily, and it affected commercial. So they lied to the people, and they knew if we told everybody all this real estate would be affected, no one would have voted for it. And so they're doing all of these, measures, and they word them tricky, and they title them all fancy, oh, this is going to help. But in fact, they haven't garnered as much money as they thought they were going to. And they're hemorrhaging the money and giving it to attorneys to fight evictions. They've stopped doing rent relief, which would help prevent the evictions in the first place. The city has used that money to, fund a bunch of different things that have gone nowhere. They have not made a dent in housing. They have not made a dent in the homeless population. The city has bought thousands of units, most of which are vacant and not housing any of the homeless people. So it's just like you just gave the city a bunch of money and they don't even know what to do with it. And they're not effectively using it, and it curbed a lot of sales.
I know.
And for real estate, it's a thing where, sales are kind of an organic thing. You buy, you sell, you keep it for a time, you sell it, you get equity, or you pass it on to your kids. And more, they're squeezing out like mom and pops and the generational wealth. And they look at people like, well, if you have real estate, you're de facto rich and like you're a problem. And that's kind of really not the way to frame the issue. You shouldn't punish people who worked really hard and bought real estate and want to give it to their kids.
And also paid tax already.
Yeah.
They already paid tax.
Well,
why are we paying tax again?
They're being taxed in multiple different, and then these micro cuts, these micro taxes. And it's these, like our sales tax goes up. Well, that affects everybody. It's expensive. But at the same time, the price of goods is going up. So they're squeezing like everybody, like your dollar is worth less now than it was 20 years ago. And the inflation, it's like outpaced. We're at the highest inflation we've had.
Okay, so let's talk about Proposition 34. Explain that one to us.
So Proposition 34 was sort of a countermeasure to prevent Michael Weinstein from doing these things again. And people have tried to talk to him about, well, why do you want rent control? Like, well, what is the end goal? We'll work with you. What do you want? Like, what is your concern with housing so we can address it? Won't say anything. So 34 came out and they said, hey, the AIDS Healthcare Foundation has to use money to further its agenda. You can't take the money that you're getting from the government for your foundation that's supposed to help give healthcare services and discounted drugs to AIDS patients. You can't use that money to go fund propositions for rent control that are not really part of like your core. So Proposition 34 would prevent essentially him from doing that, or any nonprofits from doing that. And if you're getting money from the government to spend it on this, you need to spend it on that. Like you need to spend the money on helping AIDS patients, not on trying to get rent control.
So no on 34.
So no on 33 and yes on 34.
Got it. Isn't there rent control in Pasadena?
We have rent control in several jurisdictions in Los Angeles.
West Hollywood, Santa Monica.
Santa Monica has it. West Hollywood has it. LA City has it. LA County Unincorporated has it. Inglewood has it. Culver City has it. I think we said Pasadena has it. Bell has a form of rent control. There's quite a few of them.
And how has it affected housing?
What I've seen, I'll see for a lot of when you can't tell because they don't have the data. LA City has a lot of data and they publish it. So with all the further restrictions that they've imposed, and they imposed them starting in 2023, I think evictions are an all-time high in LA City. And a lot of it is tenants are not paying their rent. I've had a client who has evicted 4 or 5 tenants that moved in this year already from not paying rent. And that's after the threshold. So the threshold in that instance, you had to be 2 months behind to meet the threshold, and they're already being evicted because they can't pay it.
And why is that? The jobs report was very good recently.
Part of it has to do with these tenants qualify. You get their rental application, you see their pay stubs, you see their credit, they look good, they look great, and then they don't pay. And part of it, tenants go, well, there's rent relief, get the rent relief. Well, there isn't rent relief for LA City. Yeah, there is. Here, I go, that's unincorporated, and it says very specifically LA City is not included. So a lot of the tenants are coming in and they think that rent relief is going to be forever because they had it during COVID. And so a lot of these tenants keep thinking the government's going to continue to bail them out. So they have the rent money, but they don't want to pay it. And then once you get into an eviction, you can't collect rent. So then they're going 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months not paying rent. You as a landlord go, okay, I'm going to waive the rent, just get out, give me my keys back. And so now you've saved yourself a half a year of rent and you're already in your next unit doing the same game. So as much as these things are meant to protect tenants, they have the tenants that are good tenants are good tenants. They don't really need protections. The tenants that are low income, these restrictions haven't helped them because they still can't pay their rent. And then the tenants that can't pay their rent that are qualifying, that meet the criteria, a lot of those tenants are gaming the system. So you see evictions being filed all the time because landlords I have to start the eviction like ASAP because I know the game. I know I'm not gonna be able to collect rent. I'm gonna be hemorrhaging money. So I maybe made 1 month of rent on the tenant. Maybe I made $2,000 and I'm $10,000 in the hole now because I simply moved them in. Then it's really hard to do nuisance evictions. But landlords are like, hey, this tenant's been a nuisance. They're violating the lease. They're moving in people that they shouldn't be. They're exasperating the situation. I'm going to gamble with the eviction. So all these things that landlords are very mellow about, very like, I'll just turn a blind eye, fine, whatever. A lot of them are being really proactive about it because it's like, I can't keep absorbing the increase of cost and regulation while having a tenant who's just like not respecting me as a landlord. And so I've seen just it, no matter how many restrictions they keep putting on it, again, you're backing landlords into a corner where they're like, I'm going to have to fight because there's no way out.
Yeah. I mean, I don't understand it because obviously I have a lot of clients who might go and work in New York for a year. So they rent out their home and now they want to come back. I guess they will be allowed back in because they're moving back in. I guess the two things are you move back into your own house or there are major plans for a remodel, correct?
For single family residences, in LA City, yes. If you're going to substantially remodel, so you're pulling all these permits to remodel, or you're going to own or occupy. I think under the state law, it's 1 year. I can't remember if LA City honors 1 year for single family or 2 year. But you still have to submit an application to the city. You have to pay the relocation.
And what's the relocation?
In that instance, it's 1 month's rent.
1 month?
Yeah. So but you have to still file the paperwork with the city. And then you have to do the 60-day notice. You file it all. If they don't move out in 60 days, then you have to evict them. And so a lot of times, like what I predominantly do is I do cash for keys. So like I negotiate or I draft up the agreement if the landlord negotiates it and says, okay, I'm going to be moving back in or I'm going to be selling the house or I'm going to be remodeling it. So instead of me going through the court and serving you a 60-day, I'll pay you a little bit extra money and we'll sign an agreement and you'll move out. And so a lot of the times tenants are very reasonable about that. Okay, no problem. I get it. I've had times where tenants are like, I want, a ton of money for that. And you go, no. So single family is a little bit, it's not tricky, but it's one of those things where they've regulated it. So it's like, now you're in a weird spot. Like, I don't really want to go file a bunch of paperwork with the city, moving back. But sometimes you move and then you go, in 6 months, I've got to move again for work. I have to do something. And so you don't want to necessarily be tethered to your house. But you also don't want to be like afraid of the situation either. So a lot of them buy their tenants out.
Yeah, it's crazy what's happening. I mean, what used to be the thing was you make some money and you buy an investment property and you watch your equity grow and you have your tenant basically pay your mortgage. And now we're in a situation where that's not really something people can do, I don't think.
No, I mean, that's like my dad taught me or, suggested, hey, became an attorney, save up your money and get like an income property so that you can live in one unit and the tenant, pays the other unit and helps with the mortgage. And that's what I wanted to do. And by the time I got to that point, it was like all these regulations were in place. And you just felt like, it's very punitive. I have a client who bought a building, 4 units. And he bought it specifically to move family into it. But it was during COVID. He didn't really understand or didn't know. So they're like, hey, you can't move into the units till after COVID. So COVID ended. The one tenant then became protected because their 10-year anniversary came up and they were disabled. All right. So the city goes, you can't do that unit. Okay. The other unit you could move into. Well, the tenant didn't want to move. And during COVID, both units were offered buyouts. And one said no. And the guy upstairs, the deal was almost done. And last minute goes, I want more money. Owner goes, I can't pay it. So a few years later, COVID's over. He does everything to the city, does everything right, puts the money in the escrow, gets all this stuff. And the tenant goes, I don't want to move. I want $80,000. The owner's been in court for like 6 months. They want to depose him. They're doing all this discovery. They're saying that he's lying, like he doesn't actually have family, that he's not actually going to live in the unit. Like you have to prove your whole life and your whole existence and everything to me. And it's like, I bought this so I can move my family into it. It's only 4 units. 2 of them I wanted to move into. I have family. I want them to move in. And now it's like you as a landlord are being grilled for your own property. Like you're some sort of like awful human being for doing that. And then, the client's afraid, like, hey, the family's kind of known to be associated with gangs. My kids go to school in the area. Like I'm afraid. Like I'm afraid they're going to retaliate against me over this. And that's where sort of the language around landlord tenant is that once you're a tenant, it's like you're forever here. You forever get to stay here. And that's not really necessarily the case. Like a tenant's right should not trump a property owner's right in some sense. But you go to court and the court entertains everything and you're in it. And as an attorney, I very well know about it. And it's super inefficient and there's different ways to go about it in different states. But here it's like, okay, well, every tenant gets free reign and then they get free attorneys. So it costs nothing to fight your eviction a lot of the times as a tenant. You just go on low income, and then EULA, those funds help go towards that. They're like being used against property. Like the very people that fund the city, the very backbone of our economy, quite frankly, our country, which is property rights. Those very people are being thrown under the bus simply because the government has mismanaged over the past 10, 20, 30 years their plan and projection for society, that now all the landlords have to bear our burden. It's crazy.
Well, thank you so much for coming. Subscribe for more information about tenant and landlord break.